All right, well, this is the next video, basically the third video doing topics on JDBC. And in this step, we're actually going to need to make sure that our database is present so the example we're about to try is going to work. As I alluded to in several of the previous videos, they make the assumption here that you went to the MySQL website, you downloaded the standalone version of MySQL that runs locally on your machine, um, and would allow you to do all the steps shown here easily, where you have complete control over username and password. And that is an option for you. Please do not hesitate to do that approach if that's easier for you. Some of us, though, don't want to go through that hassle of installing additional software, so that's my focus here, is to show you how to work with this remotely. And this actually would also work pretty similarly to what you might do as if you use WAMP or XAMPP or MAMP, which are standalone web servers with MySQL built in that would run on your local host. Now, in order to complete one of the steps here, and please mind the fact that we're on page 1180 here, that they're going to have us run a script file. And the script file is basically a long series of SQL commands that will create and populate our whole database for us. But we have to be really careful about some of the things that we're going to do in there, because you can't just drop it in and run it. That's one issue. But also because there's the tweaks that we need to make for working on a remote system with the username and password to make sure all of it's okay. All right, so let's first begin by actually finding out where we're going to get this information here. And where you're going to get that from is from the author's site. So what you're going to need to do is first log into Blackboard, apparently. But you're going to go to the resources page for our Java course. So I'm going to bring up one of the course shells here. And then you can see the instructor's companion website. So if you click that link, that will bring you here. And in order to get that particular code, if you read the book real carefully, those scripts are available from the companion website in this particular section. So supplement 4A. And I'll show you how to get there once you're at the author site. So when you're here, you need to come here to enter the site. You do need to have registered. And I'm just trying to see if there's a log out option here, because I want to show you what the screen looks like. Boy, it doesn't look like you can log out. But anyhow, if you click here, you'll be prompted with the screen. And if you have not registered, that's like one of those points where you need the book access code once again to register, and then you can have access to all this stuff. Now, I'm going to come to this little drop menu here and click on Supplement, then click Go. And then notice that there's several different types of supplements here on the side. And the one that we're interested in is part 4, the database stuff. And then we need the SQL scripts to make our stuff go. So we're working with MySQL, so we're actually going to click on this. And you can see it's just a text file is really all it is. And as such, what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to copy all the content. And I'm going to bring it over to my text editor, create a new file, paste it in, and then I'm actually going to save this. I'm going to do a save as, and then I think that what might not be a bad idea for me is to upload this to Blackboard for you guys. So I am going to do that. I'll put that on the course shell, and it'll be named what you see here, which is script.sql. And I'm going to go ahead and save that. And now you can see, just by virtue of saving it with the right file extension, how it reads all the SQL statements and color codes them, which is a wonderful thing. Now, this is designed so if you run all of these commands, in other words, you can take all this stuff here, which does a whole bunch of different steps, and you execute it as a script file, it will run every one of these statements in sequence and do all the work described within. Now, it is designed so that if you try this, mess it up, try it again, that it will kind of deal with that. And you can see here that it gets rid of a database if it exists, creates it if it doesn't, creates users, and this is the step that's important to us that we don't mess up. And I'm just going to say be careful. All right, just as a little tip, but that is the step that most likely will get stuck on. If you're using the local instance of MySQL or a local web server, once again, and I keep repeating it, I know, but I just want to make sure you get that part clear. You can probably use these commands directly as you see. On some local web servers, you might not be able to use Scott as a username. It might lock you out from doing that. So in which case you might the username might be root or admin or something to that effect. So just please be mindful of that. Everything else you can see are just regular SQL statements, create tables, we put information in, and then it always, as it goes through, checks to see basically if you've tried this before and messed it up, it'll drop the table first and then recreate it so you're not like messing up your own work. And it's okay to leave that stuff in. If we adjust anything here, it's going to be this particular step. And in fact, all of these steps here we may perform manually, and in fact I think a few of them we have to perform manually directly on either the Mercury or Kronos server in order for them to work. And I am going to go through that process, but I want you to have this script file available, and then before we execute the script file, it will depend on how things go on our server. So for right now, I'm going to save this script file. And now that I'm thinking about where did I save it? Okay, in the chapter 32 folder. I guess that's a fine place to put it. Ultimately, we'll probably want to put it in the same folder with our project, but one step at a time. All right, at this point, we're going to want to connect over to Mercury. Now, for those of you that have done this before, it's very similar to what we've done. We'll basically use Putty if you're using Windows. If you are running the Mac OS or a Linux machine, you just invoke your terminal program, in other words, your command line program, and you connect using those. Now, for those of you not familiar with command line Unix, what you'll do is you'll type in a command called SSH prior to the connection. And I'll try to demonstrate that actually. But for right now, Windows users need to have a piece of software called Putty. Now, I'm going to bring Putty up, and this is the configuration screen here. But if you do not have Putty loaded on your machine and you're a Windows user, you need to go to putty.org, and that's the entirety of the website there, and download the Putty client. It is a straight download of an exe file. So what you'll do is you'll come up here and find the right version. What I would recommend is to stay away from the beta versions and find one that is stable. So this one is the actual stable version down here, and you find Putty exe, which is the very first one, and notice that it is straight executable. There's no unzipping, no installing. You just download the file and run it. So let's say you have Putty on your machine and ready to go. And as I said before, I have launched Putty, and now I'm going to type in my server name. And in this case, we're still working on Mercury, but maybe by the time you watch this video, we'll be switching over to Kronos or some other system. So just please be mindful of it. So these instructions are designed for Mercury, and it's very likely the Kronos instructions will be almost identical. If they're different, I'll make a separate video for that. So in the connection area here, I'm just typing mercury.gtc.edu, and then I'm going to click open. One very important note is if you're using Putty and you're on campus or basically on the gateway network, you can just run it directly. If you are at home, you do need to run your VPN software. So you need to make that virtual connection to the gateway network first. Now, once you're at the prompt here, you are going to log in using your Mercury account. And just as a little side note, if you do not have a Mercury account, you're going to need to contact me in order to have one, or else you can just opt for doing a local server. I am going to put in my password, and now I am at the prompt here. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm actually going to run a couple of commands just to see where I'm sitting, and this is similar to a DOS command prompt. And the first one I'm going to type in is pwd, and that's just going to give me my location in the file system. And then I'm going to do an ls, which is the equivalent of a dir command in Windows, and I'm going to do a little bit more verbose version. So I'm going to type ls-al, and then that gives me a more detailed listing of the stuff that's in my account. Now I am going to actually change into my public HTML folder, and the reason we do that is because the stuff that's put into that folder is accessible from the outside world, either in the form of a web page or other resources. So I want to make sure that I'm in the right spot here. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to do a cd public HTML. And once again, I'm going to do a lsal. You can see I got a lot of different folders here. But what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to create a folder, and then I'm going to put my, first of all, I'm going to put my SQL script into it. Now I could probably do that by FTP, but that'll be a little bit later step. And I just want to be basically working in that folder so that when I execute certain commands, all the stuff is right there for me. Now, if you're not familiar with your command line Unix, that's not a big deal because you can just follow along here. So the command I'm using is make directory mkdir, and I'm just going to call it, let's call it db1. That's probably adequate. And now I'm going to change into that folder, and there we are. So I'm in the folder. I am going to type in my ls command just to make sure, and you can see that indeed the folder is empty, so we're all good. Now the next step is we are going to invoke MySQL from the command line, and this is in order to create the database, because on Mercury we need to manually create the database. We can't do it directly through a script. For a number of different reasons. And in worst case scenario, this is just teaching a little bit of command line stuff. So in order to connect to MySQL within Mercury, now mind you, this is a standalone database system that we need to log into before we can invoke our commands. So the command is going to be MySQL -u, and then you put in your username. So your username is going to be your RAC number. So you can see already how this is different. And then we're going to tell it that we're going to check our password, press enter, and then it will ask us for that password. All right, so if you can get to this point where you have the prompt, you're doing great, and then you're ready for the next step. Now, the next step, of course, is going to be the stuff that we see in the book. So let's bring the book back up on screen here. I'm just going to kind of have that off to the side. And we've kind of basically skipped this step. And the reason we skipped this step is because we don't have a user named Scott and a password named Tiger. And notice the little syntax approach that they're using here. They're not putting a space in between the user name and the command. You can do it either way, but my habit is to leave a space. I just, it's just the way I learned how to do it, so I've stuck with it over the years. So please keep that in mind. Okay, and this is the part where I'm going to diverge a little bit. Now, if you are working on your local machine, so in other words, you're running a local instance of MySQL, or you're using one of your own built-in web servers on your own machine, you are going to want to backtrack a page, and you're going to need to do this stuff here before you can do the stuff that we're doing. People who are not doing that, though, will follow with me, and you can see that our next step now is to actually create the database. So let's go back, bring up the prompt, and let's type in exactly that command. Now, he's using lowercase SQL commands here, and that's absolutely fine. When I learned how to do database stuff, all the commands were uppercase, and really the convention is whichever one you're comfortable with, just stay consistent is really the point. Um, for the sake of the book, I am going to use exactly the same case that he is. So I'm going to do a create database, and we'll call it Java book, semicolon at the end to terminate the statement. Enter, and now you can see that I'm getting access denied. Now this is something I alluded to in the last video and perhaps in this video too, that when we're working on Mercury, because we have a user account, we're not root on the system, we're not a root level account, we actually have to preface our database names with our username and an underscore. So you can see the entirety here is create my username RAC300 underscore database. Oh, excuse me. I'm putting that in the absolutely wrong spot, so undo that. We're going to create a database, but the name of the database is not Java book. It is RAC300 underscore Java book. All right, so hopefully that makes a little bit of sense for you. I'm going to now execute the command, and you can see that MySQL responded, and it said query OK, one row affected. So now that database is created, and what I'm going to do now is I'm going to actually type a command that's not in the book, and the command is show databases with a semicolon, and then that's going to show all the different databases that I have installed on my system. And you will see in the list here, right here, the Java book database that I created. Now the next command is the use command, and the use command just very simply tells MySQL, hey, we're going to use this particular database right now. So all the commands that follow are going to be attributed to that particular database. So I'm going to type use Java book. Now guess what's going to happen if I type that in? I'm typing it in on purpose, knowing it's going to generate an error, because once again, we need to make sure whenever we refer to that database that it has to be prefaced with your user number and an underscore, username and underscore. So now it shall work. Now we really didn't change anything. It just indicates that MySQL is now going to take the following commands, execute them on the particular database that we just told it to. Okay, so here is the point at which we are going to execute the script file. Now in order to execute that script file, it needs to be located in the folder that we just created. So in order to move that up to the server, we're going to have to bring up our FTP program. So I'm going to go here and I'm going to connect to Mercury using FileZilla. Now there is the assumption here, these courses do have prereqs for a reason, that you've done this kind of stuff before. And the point of this course isn't really to teach you how to FTP and to teach you how to do database stuff. I mean, there's a little bit of that that's going to go on, but you should know how to use Putty already, or a terminal. You should know how to FTP already. You should know some basic Unix commands just by virtue of doing this other work. All right, so I'm going to log in now via FileZilla, via FTP to Mercury, and go into my account, and then I'm going to go to the folder where we're working. And then on the local side of the machine, I'm going to go find that particular SQL file that we were working with. And what I'm going to need to do here is actually find my Google Drive folder, because that's where I keep all my stuff. If you're really having a hard time navigating your file system in the way that I'm doing, You can see I'm having enough of an issue here finding my own stuff. The one option that you have is you can always throw stuff in the root or somewhere that's really easy to find so that you don't get lost in the rabbit hole that I'm in right now. Oh yeah, that's right. So I keep looking for that, and I remember on this machine I have kind of a small primary drive because it's an SSD, so I put all my Google Drive stuff on the D drive. So once I remember that, piece of cake. All right, so we're going to Java Programming 2. I put it in the source code for the book, and that was in chapter 32, and there's the script file, and I'm just moving it over. And I was very careful to name that. Now, I already know that it contains errors and problems that will really do some things that we don't basically want to do. Let's go back now to our text editor and take a look at the stuff that might cause a problem. The one thing is that we have a drop and a create of the database. The problem here is that we already created it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually comment this stuff out. Okay, so you can see I'm putting in a note there. So we don't need to drop it. We don't need to create it. And even if we ran these commands, they wouldn't work anyhow for the same reason they didn't work from the command line. We don't need to create a user. The user is already created. And notice that we're not even going to create an alias here as he's identifying. I don't know if that'll be a big deal in the long run, but if it is, we can always drop in that alias later. We also do not need to give all these permissions because we're kind of overriding this whole first section. So let's go ahead and comment this stuff out. And then I'm also going to just put in a little note. I meant those to be asterisks. Okay, so hopefully that'll get people's attention. Now, our next thing is that we are going to go through, and now this script file hopefully will execute, and there shouldn't be any other stuff in here that's going to cause a problem. So let's save this text file now. And now that it's saved, we're going to come back here. I'm going to do a refresh, not really necessary, but I'm going to grab the script file that's been edited, move it back over. We're going to overwrite. And you can just always check to see that it's the most current version. So it's 356, and sure enough, it's 356. All right, so the script file is there. If you remember when we were on the command line in Unix, we started out in that folder. So if I'm going to scroll back, you can see that when I started my session, I put myself in my, well, I end up automatically in my own root directory. Then I changed folders to my public HTML directory. I did a listing. I then created a directory called DB1. I switched into that directory to make sure I was there. I did another ls command that you see here. So I knew that that is where I am. Now, that's important because otherwise the MySQL program will not know where to look for that script file. It will assume that the script file is wherever you were sitting last before you started running the MySQL command prompt. So that's why I'm pointing that out to you. All right, so here we are back at the prompt, and this is where we are going to resume with the commands from the book. So I'm going to bring up this, and you can see now that we're going to type in that particular command. And where's my prompt? Oh, there it is. And so I'm going to type source script.sql. Now before I press enter on this, the one thing that I'm going to mention to you is that because some of the commands that were at the top of that file we've completed, and we really also completed use Java book. That one's not going to conflict. Actually, now that I'm thinking about it, it is going to conflict because, and the reason is, so we're going to have to do another upload because it doesn't have this in front of it. Better put in another note. And save it. Then I'm just going to do a real quick thing here just to make sure that there's no more instances. Okay, so those are the only ones in the document, are the ones right here, so we don't have to worry about that anymore. Back to our FTP program, pull the file back over, overwrite, and we should be good. So it's a good thing I didn't press enter on that, because otherwise we'd get just a whole bunch of error messages. But what I wanted to note here was the fact that if, as in the previous video, remember I downloaded the MySQL workbench software, and that, as I mentioned, is very similar to working with SQL Server. So if you like that kind of an interface to run these commands, you can actually do it from that interface, even with a remote database. So you could take that whole script, drop it into the window, and then execute the query. We're just happening to do it from the command line. So let's go ahead and just make sure this window is active, and let's press enter. And you can see it did all that work. All right, and I don't see any significant errors. There was one error that I saw there. All right, so basically it's going to go through and do a bunch of stuff, and you can see I'm getting a bunch of warnings, and now I'm going to have to check and see what those are related to. So this is where I might actually defer and switch over to that other product. The reason for that predominantly is so that I can see those error messages. So why don't we just take a real quick jaunt over to do that. So here is my download directory, and in one of the previous videos I went ahead and downloaded MySQL Workbench, and this is the install file. So I'm going to go ahead and do the install. Normally this is like standard on all of my machines, but this, like I mentioned before, is a fairly fresh install. When Windows 10 came out, I wiped the whole thing and just started from scratch. So I'm going to let this do its install. And as it's doing its install, hopefully it won't take too long. If it does, I'm going to actually turn off the video and come back. So far so good though, not too long. And let's go ahead and launch the product. All right, so this is what it looks like. This is our kind of like our splash screen to get started. And what we're going to need to do is establish a new connection. And the way that you do that is you just click this little plus sign. And you can call your connection whatever you want. I'm actually going to call it what it is. For me, I'm just going to say RAC300 at, and maybe do -Mercury or something like that. Now the host name, of course, is going to be mercury.gtc.edu. Notice though that you could also type localhost here. Now we know the username is not root. The username is going to be our RAC number. And just with that little tidbit in place, you should be able to do a test connection, be prompted for your password, and if you can save it if you want, and then say OK, and hopefully you get a success screen just like that. So now that you have the connection configured, it'll appear as a little panel here, and then you can just simply click that, and then it brings up the traditional SQL editor window. So what I'm going to do now is I'm actually going to pull that script file in, and I'm just going to Control-A copy the whole thing, and then do a Control-C, come back over here in my query window, and then I'm going to do a paste. I'm not going to execute it right away, so please be wary of the fact that I didn't hit execute yet. What I'm hoping to do first is actually come over here to the list of databases that I have. So in that little Explorer section, whatever they call it here, Navigator, I guess, and then find that Java book, and notice that there are tables that were created. The columns are there. So I'm guessing that's probably worked okay. My concern is that with all those warnings that I got and then not seeing them and the sheer number of them, I didn't want to have to go manually through and look at all the error messages. I'm actually going to run this again, and I'm going to run it from this interface, and you can see how I'm scrolling up and through to make sure that there are not a lot of additional problems here. I'm noticing, though, as I scroll through and where I landed initially, there was some sort of an underline, and I'm not sure what that one is about. And it says it's not valid input at this position. Okay, so I'm not sure why it would throw that. The syntax looks okay to me, so I'm not going to change it. All right, so let's go ahead and now execute the query. Now to do that within this environment, you're going to hit this little lightning bolt. And notice what it says. It says execute the selected portion of the script or everything if nothing is selected. So you can just make sure that nothing is selected. And then let's just go ahead and hit execute. And then you can watch the results. Now the cool thing about this is if there is a problem, and you can see here it says create table staff, it says that already exists. And I'm guessing we'll probably get a lot of things that are equivalent. Now I'm not sure why stuff is being truncated, and I'm assuming that it's probably not a big deal for the stuff we're doing at this point, but at least I can see what the error messages are pretty easily and then kind of tunnel down and through. Remember, this isn't a big deal that we ran this, because what it did is if the table was already there, remember, it deleted it before it recreated it. So basically the way that the script is set up is so that if you screw things up, you can still fix it. And that was pretty intelligent from the author's sake. So now that we have all that in place, now we can get kind of back on track to where we were going with our application. The database is created. We know the right usernames and ways to access it. We did things from the command line by reading in a script file. We weren't sure that it worked as well as it should have, so we came into mysql workbench, pasted the query in, we're able to explore some of the data. And really, it's a pretty significant set of things that we've accomplished here. Some of this might be familiar to you, some of it might not, or maybe you just need a little reinforcement. Either way, it doesn't hurt to go through this stuff. All right, at this point, we can leave everything open, all the command prompt and the FTP and the workbench here. All of it can stay open while we proceed. But what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to jump back over to our text, and I'm going to move on to the next page. And you can see, well, actually not the next page. I need to go back to where I was before. I think that was a page like 1193 or something like that. Let's see if I'm right. Yep. And remember, we were working on this file. So I'm going to go back into Eclipse now and take a look. And really, our focus now is going to be to adjust this statement and proceed from there. All right, so let's go over to Eclipse and let's kind of revisit what we're doing here. Now, What's really fortunate about working in an IDE is how some of these transactional things are taken care of for us. So by virtue of the fact that we added the MySQL jar file here, some of this stuff has been taken care of already. Now, like I said before, our focus at this point is going to be to adjust this statement to do the right thing. Now, as I'm creating this video, I'm just going to give you the disclaimer right up front that this is not something I practiced on this machine because it's so fresh of an install. You know, I'm kind of starting from a baseline, so it's very likely that I'm going to screw this up here. It's a real positive mindset, isn't it? But I'm going to actually connect us to mercury.gtc.edu. And then here I'm going to put in RAC 300 underscore so it knows which database to go to. In addition, our username is RAC 300 and then our password is whatever the password is. So here's mine. If you want to destroy my stuff, feel free. No, don't. Please don't, actually. And then let's just make sure there's anything else here that we need to worry about. Oh, well, actually, one thing that we should talk about that we didn't talk about is this actual last little statement here. Now, if you've worked with PHP, for example, when we do database stuff, the way that you do things is you establish a connection, and quite often you're going to do exactly what we're doing here, which is you create a connection string. So whenever you want to create a connection or use the connection, you can just simply call upon it by name. But then after you create a connection and you're connected and you do your stuff, the etiquette is you close the connection so that the resources are then freed up for a different user to come in and do whatever they need to do. And that's what this statement is about. So that's the last part of the program, is to close the connection. It's just good etiquette, and it also helps to enforce data integrity, basically, by virtue of the fact that things are closed. Somebody else can write and not get things corrupted. Right. Control S to save. And before we actually do the execute, we need to do a little prediction as to what the output's going to be. Now notice that we are going to be basically running a query from the student table where the last name equals Smith, and then we'll get an output that's going to be like John space, excuse me, excuse me. Hopefully I didn't blow your ears out with that one. His middle initial and then the last name, Smith. So let's see what happens. I'm crossing my fingers that it's all going to run. And there it goes. And so fortunately, it worked on the first try. So I was good about guessing the right URL and database names and all that. And you can see that it actually went out now from my local machine out over the internet to Mercury, connected to my database, found the table, located the information that had the criteria of last name Smith, pulled it back to my application here locally, and then took that result set and put it out on the screen row by row using this while statement, and then closed the connection and then terminated the program. So that is a successful running of the console approach of doing this. Now you could have done very much the same thing from the command line. So our output window here is within this console view. So basically command line approach. Now the next example in the book has us do this through Java effects. And I know that it's really, for most of us, preferred that we can actually do things graphically. It will require a significantly larger amount of code because not only do we need to do all this database work, but we also need to create all the elements that are going to put it on the screen for us. So let's now jump back over to the source code for the book, and I'm going to find the source file in listing 32.2 at the bottom of 1194, just so for reference here where we are. we're going to find this particular file, findgrade.java. And really what's going to happen here is that we're going to have a little interface like this. We're going to type in a social security number, and it's going to show the grade, just so you get like a good grasp of what's happening before we actually do it. So down to chapter 32, and we're going to run find grade. I'm going to open that up once again in Notepad++. I'm going to copy the whole thing, actually with the exception of that package. I'm going to copy that. And then let's go ahead, jump over to Eclipse. We're going to create a new Java project. We'll call this the same thing that he calls it. Let's call it find grade, and that way we don't have to change any of the code to accommodate. All right, so there's our project. New class file. All right, and then the other thing that we are going to do is create all the code that we need here. And I'm just realizing that I probably just did the wrong thing. I'm actually going to delete this because it looks like I'm creating an interface as opposed to a class file. I must have, yep, went one too far. Class. Finish. And then since I already have copied all the code, I'm just going to paste it all back in. And I'm going to pay very careful attention to any underlines that appear to make sure that I don't have to go back and fix anything. Looks like everything worked out just fine. No underlines to be seen. But now let's walk through this code and kind of take a look at what it's going to do. In fact, it might not be a bad idea to look at it in the textbooks because then we can see all the little sidelines that he puts in. So the first thing is we got all our imports. Notice that we are creating some private variables here, and this is going to be now an instance of statement. And please note that you're trying to find where these are. Sometimes they're within the document, sometimes they're in external files. You can see this is actually a fairly long class file here, considering what looks like it's very simplistic. All right, so let's start with all the structural things. So there are some things that are set up, both statements, text fields, and labels, and some of these are being instantiated right here in position. We do have a stage, all the visual components, and I'm hoping at this point I do not need to explain these things to you. We have a little event handler. We also have the rendering of the stage. From there, we actually go into some private methods here, and this is pretty standard across most programming languages as well. Those of you that have worked with PHP should recognize the fact that when you initially learn to connect to a database, first you'll spell the whole thing out. Then you save the whole thing into a variable. Eventually you end up taking that whole connection syntax and you put it into a different PHP file and then just include it when you need. So this is really kind of an approach where we're creating that database connection as in the form of a method. So we can call that whenever we need it. In here, of course, we have the same kind of stuff that we just saw in our first example. So we're going to need to make those tweaks right in here to make it work. Notice that they're also doing a try catch. So if this fails, then we're going to throw out some errors. And then we're going to have the part here where we're going to show the result. And that's in the form of a method also. So it's going to show the grade, and it's going to do all these various steps. And I'm not really going to detail those because I think those are fairly obvious what they're doing. It's just a whole lot of output. And then we're also going to create this result set here, and it's going to basically run some queries for us and check a number of different things, and then bring back some results. And once again, that whole structure is in a try-catch statement. Now, if once again you make a comparison to PHP, we often within our scripts, when we're working with databases, had in there the contingency, well, what if it fails? So you always have, like, if the connection succeeds, you do all your stuff. If it doesn't succeed, throw up an error message. So that's really the same approach here. All right, so let's go ahead now and see what this does. Well, but we first have to actually adjust all our connection stuff just the same way we did before. So let's change localhost to Mercury. Remember, on your own machine, you don't need to make that change. And then RAC, your username, and then change the username and password to the correct ones for whatever system you're working on. And I don't remember which particular database system it is, but and I'm thinking actually in terms of like it's web server software. I forget if it's XAMPP or WAMP. It's one of those two where like the default default password for the root account is blank, which is kind of odd. So I would suggest adjusting that first. Now, if you did those earlier tutorials where you were able to create the Scott and the Tiger thing, then you'll be fine anyhow. All right, so that's all in place now. And really, that's probably all we need to adjust. I don't see anything else that needs to be fixed. Oh, I guess one thing that's pretty important here is we need to put in that library for the jar file. So since we have our project active, we're going to go to the project menu, click Properties, add an external jar file, click on it, open, apply, and then OK. And obviously, I'm going to pause my video here while I go get my power supply. So I'll be back with you in a moment. All right, so now I have power again, and I'm up and running. And just to make sure that MySQL library is there it is, and that gives us all those capabilities that we need. And everything, I think, is all set to run. So now what we're going to be doing is we're going to be, just from a conceptual standpoint, we are going to execute JavaFX application. So it's going to be within the graphical user interface, and it's going to look, hopefully, exactly like what's in the book. All right. And then you can see that we should be able to type in somebody's social security number, and we have an example one here, and then see what the grade is. So let's go ahead and run that. Once again, crossing our fingers that we get that connection to the external database. And notice how we got the driver loaded, database connected, and now we're going to copy that social security number. So it's 444 11 and then 1110. 444 11 1110. The course ID is 5 ones. And there you go. That's pretty good first try, no errors. And hopefully I'm hoping that you have the same success. Now, once you have these components in place, you really have all the skills, all the connections, all that stuff working. Now you really are all set to move ahead and do your homework. So that's going to be your next step at this point. And hopefully you found that useful. Now, the thing that I do want to demonstrate, or at least talk about, are some of the additional things that you can do as indicated in the chapter. So we really have accomplished, the most difficult parts. But what's interesting is that you can, just in the same way that I had a source file that I pulled in, you can have what they call a prepared statement for SQL. So in other words, you can pull in script files just the same way that will run. So That's not exactly the example they're using here, but what I would suggest is that you read this really carefully and look at some of the things that they're doing, because you'll find that it'll help you complete some of the homework. Um, and really, it's like once you have all this database connection stuff in place, and I don't know if you're noticing this, but most of this is repetition, really. And then it's just a matter of executing the right logic to make things happen. Now, I'm hoping to have some separate videos for the assignments, um, and that will kind of show you how to do those things. And then please just make sure that you read through these things. So one of the main topics here was the prepared statement, the crux of it being enables you to create parameterized SQL statements. And remember, a parameter is basically where you can throw stuff in. So you pre-create a statement, and then you insert stuff into the generic form of the statement. That's really the whole point of that. With the next topic, you also have what they call a callable statement, and that allows you to execute stored procedures, kind of like what we did before. And if you're going to execute a stored procedure, it might be something that's stored within your program. It could be in an external file as well. And they walk through the example of doing that along with sample code. So I would encourage you once again to check that out and try it. And then the other key topics here are working around metadata. And just a brief overview about metadata. Metadata is usually just information about data, or usually information about stuff that's in a database, so you know what that information is. That's really sort of the point of it. So knowing what the database metadata is important, and then also keeping in mind that when you bring back results, it ends up in a table, and that has its own data that goes with it. He has some examples for that, which I'm not going to walk through here. You can do those on your own since the code is provided. But then also has a little section here on pulling in tables, getting the results, testing those results to make sure that they're working as they should. And that basically wraps the chapter. And then you can proceed and do your homework, which starts here. So I'm going to cap this video, and hopefully I'll be able to get some for completing the exercises. But I think that the stuff that you saw in this video in particular is enough to help you complete the work, because most of the work that I assigned here is actually fairly simplistic. All right, that ends this video, and we'll see you in the next one.